section where we looked at security coming into this new paradigm that we're all facing, the way that supply chains are moving in this new phase of globalization. And there are obviously important implications for critical minerals, for other aspects such as producers and large firms. And then this nexus between domestic security and environmental goals is increasingly there as a divergence point. So we're going to try to understand these kind of new drivers of supply chains and how sustainability goals interact with national security goals and how the risks can be addressed. For all of this, we have a really terrific session, and I don't want to take away from this wonderful panel. We have Madeleine Tuninga. Did I get that right? Nearly Dutch? Dirk has to give me tuition lessons on Dutch. We have, and Madeleine is Minister Counselor at the EU delegation. We have Jodie Keane, who is Principal Research Fellow, and many more things here, of course. We have Emily Ludgate, Professor of Environmental Law, Co-Director of UK Trade Policy Observatory and Deputy Director of the Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy. We have Colette van der Wijn, who is Director of Tulip Consulting, and Colette is online. Welcome, Colette. I hope you can hear us. There she's waving at us. We have Trevor Sutton. Can you raise your hand, Trevor? Is Trevor around? Oh, there's Trevor. He's also online. And Trevor is Director of Energy and Trade and Clean Energy Transition Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia. We have George Riddell, who's Managing Director of Goida. Yeah. And that's the panel. So I think we'll just start with Madeleine, about 7 to 10 minutes maximum. 5 to 7 minutes, sorry, 5 to 7 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for having invited me. I feel very honored to be in this panel with very knowledgeable colleagues that actually I've been seeing, some of you already throughout my career, of which a big part has been precisely on the trade and sustainability interconnection. I'm currently at the EU delegation in London, heading the Trade and Economic Affairs team. So let me try to say a bit about the risks and the challenges on this. Obviously, we are entering in a new phase of globalization where security and sustainability are shaping supply chains as much as efficiency once did. And added to this is the uncertainty caused by the turbulence in the tariff field, which probably has come up this morning. Now, I think, and this is definitely one of the things that I take away also from previous jobs, it's very important that we see resilience, climate action, trade and development as inseparable elements. It's not either or, it's not a fight between these. Each has their own philosophy, and our job is really to bring these together. And in that, it remains critical that open trade, security and sustainability really go hand in hand. So what are key risks? I would say they include fragmentation. Resilience cannot mean that we turn inwards. And supply chain governance must also ensure that climate transition is not achieved at the expense of our partners. This brings also in the development dimension. Developing countries hold many of these critical resources the world needs to go through the green transitions, but they should not be seen only as providers of raw materials. So these are some of the elements in the EU thinking, also how we have been shaping our policies. So what can we do? I would say in the first place, really keep reflecting this balance, resilience, sustainability and trade in our actions. And that means domestically, ensure the openness, in our case then of trade, openness, security, resilience and sustainability. Keep markets open, avoid fragmentations, export bans and unilateralism do not help the cause of this. And it's clear for us, we do remain the biggest and open market, very interconnected with the world. So there's even no point in closing our market or fragmenting it. Sustainability at the domestic front, legislation must serve that purpose. I'm acutely aware of the large debates that the EU Green Deal has caused. I've been in the hotspot launching these pieces of legislation at the moment that I was representing the EU in the WTO Committee on Trade and Environment, where we try to really from the outset be transparent and show that our openness to have dialogue on legislation that was novel, because we have to develop legislation that helps us meet our climate and environment purposes. But in doing so, we need to keep open trade. There are trade rules to be respected, and keep up our development goals. And that's something novel, and particularly because many of these measures that you're taking have this so-called PPM. So for the first time, we developed a whole range of measures that have impact, including on the way how other countries produce their products if they want to export these to the EU market. So it's very important to see how these are developed. And I come back to that, and that's probably at the nucleus of the start of the discussions in the WTO, where we look at how is each of us taking these kind of measures. And I think if you've seen the way we are implementing CBAM, CSDDD, EUDR, as recently as a few seconds ago, we had a discussion, is it postponed or not? There is an iteration also when legislation is enacted. How does this impact others, and do we need to adjust or not our course of maybe the speed with which we do things, let's put it that way. So in our own actions, keep markets open, but in developing legislation, make sure that the supply chains are resilient, and that you help your legislation that. So CSDDD, I mentioned CBAM and others. And in terms of resilience, our goal must be to co-create resilient supply chains that add value locally by investing in refining, processing, and skills, so that green energy supply chains can also drive development. And this is also an element I come back to later when I talk about what we do bilaterally in partnering. I touched a bit on what we can do at multilateral level. As said, work on trade and climate has really accelerated. I think for those who are pessimistic about the work, think about where we were 10 years ago. I think we could even not use the word climate in the WTO. Today we can, and there are work streams, and that's a very positive thing. If it goes slowly, it just shows how complex it is to move these discussions forward. EU's been very actively involved in engaging and launching initiatives. WTO, UNFCCC, and discussions have already been firmly put on the agenda. Plurilateral work strands, I would also mention them. So in the OECD, with the International Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches, there's the Climate Club, and there is a coalition that we co-created, the Coalition of Trade Ministers for Climate, which provides political leadership. And at this point, I would really emphasize that it's really important that there are many, and I haven't mentioned all of them, but it's really important now to consolidate these fora and the work strands. It was not easy to bring them together and to bring the communities together. There is already overlaps between them, and it's good that they are taking place in different forums. But for us, the priority is really to consolidate these and bring them forward. And that includes the Climate Coalition that has been doing quite some things, integrating events on trade and climate at the COP. There's been an increasing presence there, including with the WTO Secretariat participating. We're working now to deliver something with the Coalition of Trade Ministers for MC14. And we're trying to advance further work in the WTO. That's mostly focusing at this moment on transparency and cooperation in relation to unilateral measures with embedded emissions and work on methodologies. So The chair of the Committee on Trade and Environment is taking an important role here. There are 3 work strands: transparency, development, and interoperability of measures. That becomes even more important. 5 years ago, only a handful of countries had measures, but there are now many measures. So it's really important that we work on this interoperability. Bilaterally, I would say in the bilateral work, for us, developing countries remain a key. We not only have a vast network of FTAs, but are also developing other initiatives. I would also like to mention that the EU is still the biggest donor, which is becoming even more important nowadays as others are withdrawing or reducing funds for assistance. We have several partnerships that we have developed and initiatives that actually try to pull in one or another way together public and private money and aim at a balanced outcome, bringing added value to the partner country so that we can see transformations in the country with whom we work and not just take out minerals. And maybe mention 3 elements: the so-called Clean Trade and Investment Partnerships, the CTIPs. This was launched in our trade strategy. South Africa is the first country. I don't know if there's a representative of South Africa here. The first country with whom we are developing this or testing this concept. It's to be concluded in November in the margins of the G20. And then we have the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. So far, South Africa, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And then, of course, we have the sort of bigger underlying, I don't know how to concept, the Global Gateway. And that's really putting together and supporting also these initiatives and supporting also FTAs, etc. So I don't know how far I am, but maybe I leave it here so that
would be great, and we'll come back to you in the
Yeah.
discussion. And I thought your idea of this nexus was very interesting, and the idea that trade openness through FTAs and also through encouraging resilient supply chains, and these new aid trade partnerships, I thought was very interesting, and particularly with the private sector. Jody, off to you, please.
Thank you very much. So I'm here to talk about the green squeeze, and I've spoken a lot about the green squeeze over recent years. So I thought, let me try and do something a little bit different because we are in 2025, and I don't want to be perceived to be bashing the EU in terms of its policy, because it really did go out, you know, as a first mover, as a standard setter, and we can see that there have been ripple effects. Other countries are also considering carbon markets, emissions trading schemes, and so on. But I think sitting here in 2025, I'm afraid I do get a very strong sense of déjà vu, because we know that the clock is still ticking for the EU deforestation regulation, and this measure is really important for commodity-dependent economies, which surprisingly do still make up a very large share of exports. The exports of least developed countries in particular are highly concentrated. So lots of the countries that I speak to are really, really concerned about this measure, not only in terms of how it's being designed, but also how it's being implemented. And, you know, the clock is ticking. There's a very real risk of exclusion. Based on our research, and it's ongoing, we'll be publishing soon, we can see for one particular value chain, we can see probably around 40% of producers are at risk of exclusion. And this is just because of how value chains are structured. We kind of know there's a lot of literature in terms of value chain structure, how firms are organized, different tiers of suppliers, and so on. I was in meetings over the weekend, and they were looking at this from another angle. They were looking at it more from the kind of technology adoption angle, and they were kind of showing the bottom of the pyramid. And again, it's a kind of similar thing. You've always got a kind of structure within the value chain that are going to find this hard. Any new standard, they're going to find it hard to comply because of size, firm levels, organization, capabilities, costs, existing technology, and so on. And we've learned this, there's so much literature on this. I could go on and on about different types of standards and different types of institutional responses and so on. But we do also have recognition at the multilateral level through standards bodies that provide aid for trade that also recognize that, oh, if there's a new standard, countries need time to adjust. They may need support to adjust. So the countries that I speak to are just quite surprised that this hasn't been as forthcoming as they would have liked, and the clock is still ticking, and you've got, very large real risks of exclusion. So now we're in 2025. Obviously, the security aspect and the discussion about resilient value chains, this is now shot up the agenda tremendously compared to 2023. So I wanted to kind of couch my intervention more from a perspective of trying to build resilient value chains. So if I drill down and look at one product that's covered within the 7 commodities across the EUDR, I can see that coffee, it actually features within our basket of inflation. So our economists here, they work out what our level of inflation is based on the inclusion of coffee, hot coffee drinks, and so on. So there's an aspect here that if you've got such high rates of exclusion, and we've just looked at one commodity, you could apply it across the board, and producers simply say, you know what, there's no price premium. I'm paying literally to maintain the status quo. I'll shift and I'll supply Asian markets, or in some cases shift into other types of production. In some cases, it could be different cash crops and so on. So there's a link there. What I'm trying to convey is that there's a link with we're thinking about resilient value chains, thinking about kind of import security from a different angle. And I really feel strongly that we don't have this climate change angle well enough integrated within our discussions on resilient value chains. So there can be knock-on impacts on inflation. There can be other kind of financial transmission, other macroeconomic implications for this. So I do feel that we need to be, better integrating the climate change challenge in all of its different dimensions, the mitigation, but also adaptation, the fact that you've already got loss and damage to productive structures already that is recognized within the climate change forum, but it's not recognized yet within the trade forum. So if we're thinking about how to move away from the green squeeze, I appreciate that there's a lot of focus now on new partnerships and so on, but I would actually go, as a trade economist, and a kind of person who loves looking at different types of value chains, I would actually try and drill down into, a resilient value chain. If it means more diversified supply, your ability to absorb shocks and so on, then you really want to avoid any measure that increases concentration across the value chain, because for climate resilient value chains, we need far more diversified supply chains. So that would be my main message to convey. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jody. So this resilient value chain with climate change being brought in, I thought was very interesting. And these concerns about many standards that may exist in developing countries which are facing these from Western countries, and this worry about being excluded in this story, I thought was very interesting. And also this idea of support, and you talked a bit about finance and the new partnerships. And I think that very much complements Madeleine's earlier point about what the EU was doing. Very, very nice. Let me now invite Emily. Please, go ahead.
So I am also going to make the potentially foolhardy strategy of critiquing the EU regulations in front of our esteemed colleague from the Commission. I think that actually what I would echo a lot of Jody's points, maybe from a slightly different perspective, in the sense that she likes to talk about the green squeeze. I like to talk about the trilemma. So I think that a lot of these EU supply chain environmental regulations, their design presents a trilemma between, on the one hand, the environmental ambitions, on the other hand, the technical feasibility in the real world, and finally, the international equity and fairness, of which, of course, developing countries are a big part. And of course, if you have a trilemma, there are trade-offs. You can't optimize all the objectives. So this raises the question of which objectives are being prioritized and why. And I think what we're seeing as we're watching these regulations in different ways and at different rates, and here I'm talking about not just CBAM, but also EUDR, also CSRD, and oh my God, Triple D, CS Triple D, you know, with the omnibus regulation and things and discussions about how they should be reformed, we're seeing a lot of these tensions and play out in discussions. But what seems to be at the forefront of the imperative that's being put forward is technical feasibility. So the trade facilitation aspect is at the fore. So for example, in the CBAM context, you know, let's exempt the firms that are emitting less than 50 megatons a year. Let's make it easier to use default values. And, you know, that's really an important agenda. And if I have any questions about what's happening with CBAM with firms in the real world, I call up George. So I'm going to defer all your questions about that to George, and I won't dwell on it. What I wanted to talk about today was really what I think is the harder unfinished business aspect of that trade-off between the environmental ambition and international equity and fairness, particularly for developing countries. I think it's useful to, you know, to keep in mind that the EU has framed CBAM in a sense as a global public good, right? That by introducing this, it will incentivize exporting firms to green or decarbonize their exports, also that, or even to introduce their own domestic carbon pricing, right? So they can capture those revenues domestically. But as you know, Jody was saying, of course, the risk is that, you know, the mighty international river of commerce, when it encounters an obstacle, instead of going over it, it just goes around, and the EU ends up driving inflation and for its own consumers, and becoming increasingly unable to compete. And I think obviously that's one of the sets of concerns driving these reforms and the omnibus reforms. And of course, particularly at risk are SMEs and developing countries. So how to address this risk? Some might say, we have argued that one approach would be to exempt least developed countries from CBAM. So you could just exempt, you know, based on this type of vulnerability. I think that doesn't seem to be on the cards. I think it's been at this stage ruled out exempting LDCs or exempting SMEs. But even if we give up on this, I think there's a strong case for the EU to reconceptualize what success means, at least for the first couple of years of the implementation of CBAM and these other types of regulation, these other supply chain regulations as well, and then make changes based on that. So I think I would argue that success for CBAM is not really about extending the EU's ETS price initially. It's much more about getting as many firms as possible to understand how to measure their actual emissions. Because that is essentially, and I should say that, you know, CBAM isn't the only driver of this. There's a lot of other, you know, CSRD is another driver of this, but there's also a lot of ESG private sector levers that are pushing firms to do this. There are voluntary standards that support this. So there's a lot of, and I think, you know, as we were discussing earlier, a vast complexity of different ways in which this conversation is being had, in which these standards are being put forward. So that's the world we're in. But really, I think that that is coming up with some way for the CBAM to support that measurement as broadly as possible, And also the interoperability and recognition across different systems is the foundation for actually CBAM being applied more broadly, and for, in a sense, some of the toughest problems in trade and climate cooperation to move forward. So I think this is a tough sell because what it implies is potentially moving away from a conformity a very rigorous kind of, well, let's say rigor is equated with harmonization. So the only way we can know that we're really doing what we want to with CBAM and achieving our environmental ambition is by having the exact same model as the EU in terms of EU emissions price being extended. And this might require, coming up with these flexibilities might require being open to different forms of recognizing equivalence and waiving CBAM. And I think there's been some noises that maybe there might be a little bit of flex, but nothing has really definitively happened. So yes, transparency is the foundation of interoperability, is I suppose what I'm saying. And I think that is very much what happened domestically when EU ETS was introduced. It was widely seen as a failure. I mean, environmental types just were horrified because essentially what it did is give a windfall to the steel industry. It was really underpriced. But what was happening in that time was a huge learning process. So, and that I think was less visible, but was really important. All these firms were actually learning, oh, this is how we measure this is how we measure what we're emitting. And that then became the foundation whereby the ETS could actually be tightened in an effective way. So I think that learning process is really important. And I would just say something really quickly as well about the UK and how the UK fits into this, since we're in the UK, which is that I think that, it's great for the UK and the EU that they're talking about cooperating on ETS linking. That's a harmonization model, more or less, for being excused from CBAM. But what that doesn't do anything for third countries that are trying to export. And so the risk of trade diversion for the UK is even greater than for the EU because its requirements are slightly different from those of the EU, and it's a much smaller market. So I think this is a serious concern from the EU, from the kind of UK's development ambitions, that it's really creating quite an obstacle, but also just domestically that it's going to create a lot of market access barriers pursuant to CBAM. So I think that really underscores the importance of, for the UK, of foregrounding CBAM cooperation with the EU, CBAM alignment, as well as ETS alignment. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Emily. And so you have the trilemma, which is different to Jodi's green squeeze, we think, or not. We want to hear later on what the differences really are at an infinite level. You underline this importance of the CBAM equity issue for developing countries and the incentivization to decarbonize, which I thought was interesting, and then these risks, particularly for small and medium enterprises. And this question of, how do we treat these exemptions? And I thought that was interesting. And the idea of interoperability and, co-equivalence? I think that's a word people sometimes use, where you mirror standards, and that comes in the context of the UK story, which I thought was very interesting. Let's now move on to Colette. You're online, I think. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me
Great.
as well?
Please, Colette is Director of Tulip Consulting. Please, Colette, you have 5 to 7 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Great to be here. I wish I could be with all of you in the room, as I see some familiar faces here. In the conversation topic around the intersection of supply chain resilience, climate goals, and development, I'd like to share a few thoughts that are coming out of ongoing research that we're doing at Tulip Consulting that's focused on CBAM and the Indian steel sector, and more broadly, the Indian decarbonization imperative for the steel sector. So a couple of things, we're in the middle of this research, but already we can highlight a few things. One, to start with, what I find really interesting, going to India and speaking to numerous stakeholders on these issues around trade and CBAM and steel and what have you, is that there is a slightly different narrative that's happening in, say, circles here in Geneva, where I am, or in Brussels, and possibly in London as well, as there is on the ground in a place like India. From all the interviews that we did, not a single person said decarbonizing is not what we want or is not what we should do. Everyone said, yes, we understand we have to decarbonize the steel sector. And that is really interesting. And I think that that goes towards an overarching point that there might be a need to shift the narrative away from positions and positioning on CBAM between, you know, the global north and the global south, or the EU versus developing countries, towards possibly a more nuanced approach on saying, well, what are the different countries' interests and how can we unpack that? And is there a way that we can collectively go towards those interests? Now, within India, it's really interesting because the steel sector in India is projected to almost quadruple by 2050. Quadruple, right? 4 times what it is today. That is enormous. And at the same time, the steel sector in India has the world's second largest greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a very dirty sector, which is reflecting in part structural characteristics, coal dependency, low quality iron ore, induction furnaces, and what have you, a large number of SMEs playing a role in the steel sector. But in that landscape, the government, the Ministry of Steel in India has announced a Green Steel Roadmap, very much identifying, it's a 300-page plus document, very much identifying ways in which the Indian steel sector can go towards decarbonizing, and at the same time, within the reality that the steel sector is going to continue to grow, right? So beyond the move towards shifting from position to interest, I think there's also a reality that we need to acknowledge, that even if there is you know, a more collective approach, understanding we all have to decarbonize, there's that reality that comes out, I think, very much in countries like India, where there is the economic growth story and steel being critical for that. There's the poverty issue and everything aligned with that. And there's a decarbonization story. Where does CBAM come in here? CBAM, from the research we've been doing, is very interesting because in many ways, it is a limited tool to decarbonize, say, steel production in the Indian Indian market. Why? Because only a little bit more than 6% of Indian steel is actually being exported. So in order for the steel sector in India to go towards or to green, it has to go beyond CBAM. That, I think, gets us into a couple of interesting elements. One is there is, and this was already mentioned in the panel, there is a push, including in India, to develop a carbon credit trading scheme, right? And to start that. Now, if you unpack that push, or if you unpack that scheme, basically, it's a baseline and credit scheme. So it means that companies are only required to pay for the emissions beyond a certain target. And the targets are having quite low ambitions. So it means that most companies may not be paying very much. What that means under CBAM is that any reductions companies might get for what has been already paid in the Indian market is going to be very minimal under Article 9 if the scheme gets recognized, which the communications that had come out last week on strategic framework suggested. But it also means that I think the tension comes in very clearly here, because on the one hand, there is a push by environmentalists that say India's ambition needs to go up, the price per carbon has to be higher, and the targets have to become more ambitious under the scheme. But then there's the risk of inflation. There's an economic reality with low profit margins, especially for the SMEs, and all the other elements that come with it. So there is a bit of a tension here in certain ways between trying to bridge climate goals and India's decarbonization trajectory with its economic growth story, and then how all of that features into development, into CBAM. And we heard about interoperability and things like that, which is of course key. But I think there's also a dimension to it, which is that in the end, the Indian exporter is going to pay, right? Whether you got CCTS, the carbon credit scheme, or whether you got interoperability or what have you, there is going to be a price tag to this. Whether that price is being paid in the Indian market or in the EU or at export levels, there is going to be a price. So I think that story about there is a price, it's still going to be paid. What does that mean about development and inequality and all the other elements? Possibly doesn't get enough attention. I think related to that is the disaggregation. Emily mentioned it already. SMEs are really exposed here, whereas the larger integrated steel producers basically will be just fine because they produce green steel. They can ship that to the EU market, at least under current shuffling rules, whereas the SMEs don't have the capacity. And that gets to another point, which is where I think arguably CBAM is one of the biggest tensions of CBAM or difficulties, which doesn't quite get as much attention, is that it doesn't focus enough on the unequal abilities countries have to decarbonize, and because of access to finance, different structural characteristics, and what have you. That I think really is very critical in this story. And the question is, how can trade and investment be leveraged not just in the CBAM context, but beyond, as a way to stimulate green value chains, to unlock opportunities for more innovation within these markets, and to potentially also create export opportunities. That gets me to I lost track of time, but two final quick points. One on that. Somebody mentioned hydrogen, green hydrogen, and how the EU is investing in green hydrogen in South Africa through clean trade and investment partnerships. They're also looking into India and other countries. A query is whether that makes the most sense, right? Investing all of that into green hydrogen and other renewables elsewhere, and then shipping that back to the EU for processing within the EU. And there are some ideas that are being put forth by different organizations that are trying to identify how the supply chain can better address comparative advantages and development and things like that. So there is, for example, an idea on that's being developed where India would be an exporter of, say, green iron, where hydrogen would be used in India to green the iron, and then that would be exported to the EU, which makes more sense from a cost perspective, and then that could be developed into steel in the EU. So there are some interesting ideas like that on how to reimagine the value chain and invest in decarbonization and different areas where it makes sense along comparative advantages. Then I will end on the note of the role of scrap. Especially scrap is key for decarbonizing steel. Scrap has 0 emissions under CBAM, and in the EU, a lot of companies are relying on scrap to decarbonize steel, but a lot of other countries that had historic low steel consumption levels, like India, don't have enough scrap to decarbonize steel. But now there are restrictions on the export of scrap steel from the EU to non-OECD countries. So there is a bit of tension there as well. And going back to the point about creating the enabling environment to mitigate, to decarbonize. So my final point would be to look at the intersection between those different measures and how they all intersect or not, and how all of that ultimately can contribute to creating a mitigation environment, decarbonizing abilities, not just in the EU, but also and especially perhaps in those markets that are growing in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tulip. This was a very nice case study unpacking the Indian story of trying to decarbonize, particularly via the steel industry. And you brought out, I think, this issue of growth versus decarbonization challenges, this issue of who pays for it, which is very important, and this different issue of large versus small firms. The large firms can do, but the smaller ones need some support. And then this additional point I thought about scrap, I thought was very interesting as well. So there's this really interesting kind of ground level story which we covered. Let me now bring in Trevor Sutton, who is Director of Trade and Clean Energy Transition, as well as the Center of Global Energy Policy at Columbia. Trevor, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you quite well. Can you hear me?
Yeah, 5 to 7 minutes, please, Trevor. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. I had hoped to be there in person, and in fact, that had been my plan. I was in London yesterday, but I had to come back to New York in connection with an event that I'm going to touch on at the end of this intervention. But it's great to see all of you, Colette in particular. Wonderful to see you. That was extraordinarily insightful, as always. I am very happy to report that I am not going to talk about CBAM, at least in the next 5 to 7 minutes. I was asked to talk about some of the trade policy challenges relating to increasing demand for clean energy technologies and critical minerals. And I wanted to highlight 3 trends in that regard that are frustrating cooperation around clean techs and critical mineral supply chains, and talk about where we might go from there. So the first trend is that as decarbonization is increasingly perceived not just as a climate imperative, but a major driver of growth and investment in the coming decades, countries are increasingly apprehensive about being locked out of that economic opportunity. I mean, some countries are, of course, happy to be end users of clean tech, but many others would like to participate in clean energy supply chains to a greater extent than they do today. Or if they're already participating in them, they would like to move up the value chain. This is, of course, very true of countries rich in critical minerals who would like to be more than a site of extraction. But it's also true of advanced economies that are concerned about maintaining an industrial base. And it's even true about countries that have already received a lot of FDI into the clean tech sector. For example, those in Southeast Asia that in some cases are frustrated that investment has not produced the upskilling, knowledge transfer, and value-added economic growth that they're looking for. So the second trend is about the extraordinary concentration of clean energy supply chains, and this is something Jody touched on previously. I'm waiting to be corrected, but as best I can tell, there's really no precedent in the modern economy for the level of concentration we're seeing in the clean energy sector, at least relative to any other strategically important sector. And of course, here I'm talking about China. I mean, China's dominance of clean energy supply chains is simply astonishing. Anywhere between 2/3 to over 90% of manufacturing and share of global exports of a range of clean energy goods that is growing, as well as an unrivaled status when it comes to processing critical minerals. I mean, really the only critical mineral which China doesn't have a sort of complete dominance is nickel. And there, the competitor, Indonesia, is in that position because of Chinese investment. So I'm not saying that this is necessarily a bad thing or that China got there illegitimately, and there are, of course, many benefits. But it is nevertheless the case that I don't think it's invalid that some countries, particularly net importers, perceive that concentration as a threat to resilience, as a drag on a just transition, and in the case of the United States, where I am currently, a national security threat, as difficult to believe as that might be to folks outside North America. But even if you don't view concentration in quite those sort of drastic terms, it's also the case that it could be, and I think credibly viewed as a potential obstacle to attracting investment, to ensuring an equitable distribution of global investment into clean tech, particularly manufacturing. So how do you address that? Well, wealthy countries, of course, have engaged in subsidy-centered industrial policy, but that is not an option that's available to a great deal of the world, particularly developing countries that are emerging from the COVID pandemic with constrained fiscal space, and which already don't necessarily have the administrative capacity to do that kind of industrial policy. Now, if you have non-fiscal leverage, you could potentially attract investment that way. That is what Indonesia did with its export ban on nickel ore. But few countries are in such a privileged position. And then the third trend is that all this is happening against a backdrop of the fragmentation and the erosion of norms in the multilateral trade system, and the failure year after year to mobilize climate finance on a scale that is needed to realize climate targets and provide sustainable development pathways to low and middle income countries. So, there are other factors, but if it's not a perfect storm, it's certainly an often toxic brew, the result of which is participation in clean energy economy and access to, technologies that will drive decarbonization, and critical minerals they're increasingly treated as a zero-sum mercantilistic project. And even countries that are inclined to cooperate, they lack the shared norms, rules, institutions on which to do so. And I think we see this in the sort of the debate over subsidies linked to sustainability aims, to debates over export bans and export controls related to critical minerals, to compulsory licensing of clean tech IP, so on and so on. And really I think what's driving a lot of these controversies is that, one man's protectionism, or rather one person's protectionism, is another person's justified response to the urgency of climate change, or to the threat of premature industrialization, or to the failure of the trade system to provide adequate tools to mitigate supply chain dependencies. But, if there's a silver lining to this, I think that it does create a lane for like-minded countries that share a common goal of rules-based cooperation to look past existing rules and institutions, which I think even defenders of the multilateral trade system would say are not fit for purpose in certain ways, to new forms of cooperation, to new coalitions, and potentially to new rule books that are more aligned with the clean energy economies exist today. And some of that is already happening. It's happening at the level of convergence around high-level principles. For example, the G20 principles on trade and sustainable development. It's also happening around what I might call the easier areas of cooperation, for example, around technical standards and around carbon accounting. We're seeing that in the OECD Inclusive Forum on carbon mitigation approaches and in other settings. But it's an open question whether these sort of softer forms of cooperation can translate into meaningful solutions to the more difficult debates that and thorny issues that I mentioned earlier. There's a very interesting proposal out there from Harvard MIT that talks about the formation of a climate club that's based around a shared carbon pricing approach. In which countries that are members of the club have a common external CBAM, and then some of the revenue is directed towards decarbonization projects and the low-income members of the club. Very cool idea. I don't know how politically feasible it is, but I also wanted to flag that Brazil, as COP30 president, has announced it intends to create an integrated forum on trade and climate change. I was at the WTO last week, and President Delago gave a surprisingly stirring speech about the forum. And this afternoon in New York, he's going to be doing an event with Colombia in which he's going to talk about it again. And that may be another venue in which we can explore in a constructive way how to detoxify some of these really fraught issues and find a path forward that's cooperative and mutually beneficial to all.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Trevor, for bringing out this trade policy side of the demand for green tech and how that works. And particularly this set of issues around decarbonization as the growth driver, with some countries having benefited and others not done so well. And you brought out the Southeast Asian case, I thought, which was very nice. And then you brought out the concentration of green tech in these supply chains around China and the national security threat that's seen by another big player. And then this issue of industrial policy without fiscal space. And then these coalitions with like-minded countries, Climate Club, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you. That was very helpful. Now, last but not least, we have George here. Please, George, go ahead.
Thank you. What's left to say after such impressive colleagues and their interventions? I thought I might focus on some of the sort of practical business realities of some of the tensions that we've been talking about and how they potentially present themselves as we're currently seeing in the global economy, and whether there really is sort of that tension between security and sustainability. I think anyone who's seen all of the push for nearshoring, friendshoring, whatever we're calling it, over the past years, recognizes that no matter how quickly governments want it to happen, it does not happen overnight. These supply chain shifts do take a considerable amount of time. It's not just a case of the government announcing something and the CEO read it in the Financial Times the next morning. Other newspapers are available because I know Peter's not currently in the room. And then the next day after, the supply chain shifted. Businesses need to conduct extensive location assessments. So where are they going to move their supply chains to? And then need to onboard new suppliers, which can take anywhere from 3 to 18 months, depending on the complexity of the particular supply chain and component that we're talking about. In that location assessment, trade really is only one factor that businesses are going to take into account when looking at moving their supply chain. You've got your physical supply chain routes. So can I actually get the product to a port? Are the, roads good enough? The trip from on the shipping line from that port, is it, liable to get attacked by pirates? Is it going through a particularly dangerous sea route? Is a big concern at the moment for many businesses. You've got labor skill and availability. Anyone who's been sort of following the TSMC saga, and they're a supply chain, they're a semiconductor manufacturer primarily based out of Taiwan, but sort of looking to expand into the EU and the US in Arizona. Their biggest complaint is they simply do not have enough skilled engineers in order to run the machinery that needs to be run. Labor skill is a massive issue. You've got the tax regime. Is it sort of advantageous for me to locate my factory there or not? You've got production standards, and then you've got all of the other local rules and regulations that businesses need to follow when entering a new market. That whole sum together normally will be what determines whether or not a company sort of can even shift its supply chain with any degree of rapidity. Then we sort of reach sort of the intersection between company desires and some of the policies that we've been talking about over the course of today, where that tension between security and sustainability really does come out even more clearly. To pick a couple of real life examples that I've been working on over the past couple of years, the European wind turbine industry is a really prescient example here, where there is a huge electrification drive within the EU in order to decarbonize the electricity grid. Very, very important for some of the longer term sustainability objectives within the industry. But what's a wind turbine made of? Steel, aluminium, and concrete. Those are three of the core products being covered by EU CBAM. And some of the work that we've looked at, an offshore wind turbine by 2034, potentially increasing in cost by €1.5 million per turbine. It's, in the context of a big offshore wind turbine installation, that's not necessarily a figure that's not unable to be overcome, but it is an extra cost that you are putting on that decarbonization policy that's being put in place. It also makes electricity trading in the North Sea more difficult. The Commission has listened to industry on that and is making it slightly easier, but it has still caused tensions between the different interconnections. And then you've also got the European domestic industry when it comes to steel and aluminium, who are saying, no, it's actually a national security threat. Forget CBAM. Oh, by the way, it's quite protectionist and useful for us. What we want to do is completely lock down because we need to rearm Europe, and it's become a security question when it comes to producing armaments and munitions for the industry. Forget sort of some of these sustainability questions that are being put in front of us. There's also much bigger trust issues when looking at the wind turbine industry. You've got physical risk. So Russian flags fishing vessels and this is publicly available information, have been trying to bomb certain installations in the Baltic and North Sea over the past couple of years. And you've got several hacks that have occurred on critical national infrastructure related to electricity generation, also wind turbines. So all of this together makes it quite a challenging environment for businesses to overcome, and that's in Europe. Another example is around this deforestation question and adaptation, which many developing country producers see it as a crucial security question, because if they're unable to adapt, they're not going to be able to continue to have their livelihoods. That's both true from a business and a government perspective. But if you are a coffee plantation who needs to move the altitude of that coffee plantation due to rising temperatures and move it up to slightly cooler climates, you will no longer be able to export to the EU under the EU deforestation regulation. Even if you completely reforest the old plantation and sort of do as low impact planting of new coffee at that higher altitude, because it's been deforested in the last 3 years, that is a ban on your products entering the EU. So there are these tensions that are going to increasingly arise as countries adapt to climate change and change where perhaps they, are producing things in different places. Europe doesn't necessarily have this problem because they deforested huge tracts of land 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So these tensions, I think, we're yet to really see emerge beyond some of the political conversations that people have talked about here today. What are businesses doing about all of this? Actually, some of the business solutions to both sustainability and security are often find a lot of commonality. It boils down to you need to know what's in your supply chain. You would be amazed at how many businesses still don't know, despite multiple, conflicts, the COVID-19 pandemic, and all the rest of it, that they're still very bad on what's actually in their supply chain. If you don't know what's in it, you don't know where your vulnerabilities are, and you don't know sort of what your environmental exposure is either. So that's the one thing that I spend a huge amount of my time on, is just figuring out what's in them, how to monitor, how to measure, and then you can start to plan afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you very much, George. So for reminding us of the drivers of supply chain locational decision making. And if I remember, you talked about supplier base, you talked about logistics, you talked about skills, and you talked about business regulations, which I think are all critical. And in some ways, these are more important when we're talking about green supply chain relocation. And then you talked about this security, environmental tensions, and I was struck by your last phrase, know what's in your supply chain, and also your environmental exposure. So I think that was really good. So we've had a really good set of presentations covering many aspects of this topic. I think we'll open up the floor for questions, and we'll also open up online. Patrick, please.
This question may or may not. Sorry, thank you. May or may not be relevant, but George said a couple of things just now, which makes me think that it might be. When I left the WTO, went to Hong Kong, I spent 2 years with a team examining the supply chains of companies, of particular product lines of companies across Asia. We went to, I don't know, half a dozen countries, measuring the contribution of services in the whole production structures of these supply chains. And without exception, with about 35 different cases, without exception, services in most cases were far and away the largest source of value in those products. So my question is, does this matter to this discussion we're having now? Are there substitution questions? I'm not sure, I just don't know, but it was really noticeable. And a lot of the firms that we interviewed were a bit gobsmacked, because exactly what George said, they didn't know what was in their thing until we actually decomposed them, deconstructed them, and made measures of the value attributable to each of the inputs.
Thank you. We'll pick up a couple more. Please, Brendan, and then lady here, and then Amrita. Thank you. If you could give your name and where you're from, that would be really helpful. Sorry, Patrick was former chief economist of WTO, amongst other accolades.
Thanks, Ganesh. Brendan Vickers, I'm with the International Chamber of Commerce. We also the official convener of business at the Climate Change COPs. Just agree with George that I think Scope 3 emissions are a huge headache for business in developed economies, but particularly also then in countries with less capabilities. Just a scenario and a question. So I think, the scenario is that the EU market could become unattractive, unviable, uncompetitive for exporters, because either they face high carbon footprints in their production, or they can't demonstrate compliance or trace their emissions, or they simply cut out of a supply chain because of various factors. So what happens then that these goods simply divert to less regulated markets, could be in Africa, South Asia, parts of Latin America. So we're not really solving the problem, because the carbon leakage doesn't disappear, rather just shifts onwards elsewhere. And so you have these developing economies, least developed countries, that end up importing the embedded carbon. So the question is, if anyone has any thoughts about this, is how do you address this risk? How do you mitigate the challenge of a potential fragmented world where you have, on the one hand, clean markets, the US, the UK, the EU, versus those that are perhaps dirty markets that are absorbing all these goods, often through dumping?
Please, the lady here and then Amrita. Yeah.
Thanks. Really interesting conversation. I'm Ellie Belton. I'm a senior policy advisor at E3G. We're a climate think tank and I lead our work on trade. Very interested that I think nobody said the word Trump. Maybe I missed it, but I don't think anybody did. And Trump has had implications for tariffs, obviously, which impacts supply chain resilience. He's withdrawn the US from the Paris Agreement, big implications for climate goals, and obviously aid cuts, which has big implications for development. So everything that's happened in the last, let's say, 12 months as a result of Trump and the implications then more widely, globally, do you think this has a long-term impact on everything that you guys have just discussed? Or do we think actually a lot of these, you know, the relationship between trade and climate and development that we've been talking about for a long time is broadly the same, and this is hopefully just a blip in the long-term trajectory? But I'm just interested in you think how the last 12 months have changed your reflections. Thanks.
Thank you. Amrita?
Thank you. Thank you to the panel for the very interesting contributions. My question probably follows on about, you know, the role of business. My name is Amrita. I'm from the Institute of Development Studies. And for us, the role of business in development is quite important. And I know that development is a contested term. Both the previous panel as well as this panel, you know, we've alluded quite a lot to this sort of issue of compliance and, you know, equity and ensuring that compliance. And I thought that George's, you know, contribution was very comprehensive about how businesses think about that. I'm just wondering, and maybe this is a little bit conceptual, but like, you know, foreign firms, or for example, we know that, you know, EU has a presence across Africa. So there's more than 8,000 firms in Africa. You know, in India alone, there are more than 6,000 firms. So I'm just thinking, how do foreign firms, you know, they may be like 50% invested, or they may be, you know, 100% owned European firm. How are the strategies, or like how strategies are adapting to these changes? How is there a difference? So do we see a difference in how foreign firms based in Africa are reacting to this vis-a-vis purely domestic or partly domestic firms? So just kind of thinking, maybe there are insights from your work, or, you know, thinking about sort of as we think about this adaptation and responses further, are we going to see a clear difference and shift in how strategies of firms orient themselves? Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions from, please? And then there's a colleague at the back. Sorry.
Perhaps I'm going to respond, given that I represent a couple of businesses that work in the region. One of the platform the members of East African Association use is the European Business Council for Africa, which represents about 4,000 businesses. And what they do is they use this platform to have a voice within the EU Commission. And there's a general feeling that yet they do support the climate vision for the European countries. However, they look at it as being punished, or as being caught up in the politics. So EU political sort of vision is just entangled in all this. And so the platform is to lobby through these organizations. I'm sure perhaps under the ICC or other bodies, the national chambers or so, great platforms for businesses to just have a collective voice and engage with the policymakers to push for their agenda.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bernardo?
Thanks, Bernardo Arce from ODI. Just kind of a broad question and touching upon one of the elements that Trevor mentioned about the COP Brazil presidency proposing this intergovernmental forum on climate and trade. So just curious about the panel's view on this panel, if it will replicate some of the limitations of the multilateral institutionality and some principles that may lead the work of this forum. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I'll give the panel a last point, please. And then we've got a lot of material after that to try to get the panel to respond. Please.
Thank you, Ganesh. Excuse me. Thank you, Ganesh. It's a point and not a question. Very briefly, I was just reading Le Monde during the boring bits this afternoon, and they're saying that the Commission is going to delay the implementation of the deforestation policy by 12 months. And 12 months leads to another. So maybe there's implications for CBAM anyway.
Great, thank you very much. Now let me give the panel a chance. Let's go with Madeline, Jody, Emily, and so on. Madeline, do you want to say anything, please? Any of these questions, any
There
points?
are many, so I'll give, I think that the last one is in most need of clarification. As we speak, the only thing I know is that the Commission has written to the EP and the Danish presidency on potential delays. So follow the press and you'll hear it. It shows how complex it is. And I think it's good that there's a mechanism to be aware of the difficulties and if needed, that there is a further delay. The Brazilian presidency paper, we're looking at it. We do have questions. There are, as you know, and I mentioned already, we launched this initiative of trade ministers for climate. There are, I believe, 64 countries. Brazil could join. It's precisely to work on this nucleus, trade and climate. Whatever comes out, it's very important that we don't have too many initiatives, but that we really concentrate on the delivery of it. So I think there's clarification to be done. We will be the first to want to engage on any process that delivers on this agenda. Yes, how can you, we didn't mention Trump. I mean, I don't think it's to me to discuss Trump. But no, tariffs have obviously an impact on what's happening. I think we can certainly confirm that, and everybody is trying to, on the one hand, deal with the reality and deal with the impact of Trump's, in our case, to the EU, but at the same time, look at what we do globally. And I think, follow and see what everybody says, whether it's the UK, the EU, everybody's emphasizing diversification and broadening partnerships. There's a new dialogue, EU CPTPP. 5 years ago, that would probably not have been there, but there's now a new initiative to go there, talk about inter-alia economic security. So I think there are interesting developments as we see that that we need each other to keep, and that we have an interest in the global trading system and keep stability. And then there was one I wanted to add, but it escaped me. So I'm in this, for the benefit of time, I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Jody.
Sure, thanks. So thanks very much. Is it the great questions? I'll probably just start from the top, really, start from Patrick's and try and work my way down and cover all of the points, because I do think you raised a really important point here about, really kind of decomposing and looking at the value addition from, it could be services, it could be nature-based services as well within, a given product. Because what I also see is that the role of aviation and maritime shipping is, you've got lots of developments going on within those transportation sectors on pricing carbon, especially within the maritime sector. And I don't think we fully appreciate them because we're also fixated on the kind of territorial carbon. And we've got this huge headache on scope 3 that was mentioned when you try to kind of map out and trace the full footprint. So I think it is a noble endeavor. And I do remember that, and Ganesh probably will remember all of this, when global value chains suddenly became fashionable and everyone was talking to them just as kind of things were changing. But nonetheless, there was the trade in value added database. And my understanding is that this was originally developed to actually look at carbon, but then it changed to look at, and now the whole thing's changed and no one really uses those databases. But anyway, so I do think, shifting and especially looking at the role of different types of services, giving greater consideration to nature-based services as well. I think that this is key. And I tend to think that this is perhaps where the Brazilian proposal is headed, because we know that they're also putting out different proposals on forestry services, related services. And so for me, having a more, a comprehensive approach to valuing services that help preserve biodiversity, help reduce and help us get out of the climate emergency. I think that we just don't devote enough attention to these. No one likes talking about carbon markets. No one really likes them, but we also know that we need them to work. you know, if we're going to keep global temperatures low, and we know we've already we're at 1.5 now, given current commitments, it looks about 2.7, even 1.5, the built-in rise now it has profound implications that we have not even begun to consider. So I hope that that's where the Brazilians are going with this approach. But I'd also echo the points by Madeleine that there's a lot of other people looking at common MRV systems. You've got, you know, the trade ministers, but you've also got a task force of other international agencies as well, though I'm yet to see any reports yet from that group. So it would be good to know how they all interact. And then my final point really about Trump and the rollback and so on. I mean, I tend to think that, you know, multinational firms, big corporations, they totally get the sustainability challenge. You know, they've already made investments. So I tend to stay, you know, more positive that business gets the challenge, and that hopefully we can kind of ride the, we can get through and keep sustainability goals on track.
Thank you. Emily?
I'll just say a couple of things. So I wanted to address Brendan's question, because I think I was trying to address that in my comments. So obviously I wasn't very clear. So I want to have another stab at it. So so I think if the EU and other, you know, strict regulators want to avoid, mainly the EU, want to avoid being, you know, the cause of trade diversion, the key is flexibilities. There need to be more flexibilities. And I think that manifests as, you know, slower implementation, more phasing in of implementation. I think that manifests as engaging really, really strongly in international discussions. I think we have a bit of a crisis of forum shopping with respect to where all these issues are, what are these standards and who's setting the standards and which standards do we all pay attention to? I don't think there's a clear answer yet. Does Brazil have the answer to this? Does the OECD, does the WTO? But I think we're in a phase where what is clear is that there's an increasing benefit for firms to understanding their supply chains. And to understanding their emissions, including the dreaded Scope 3 supply chain emissions, and that feeds into different private sector drivers and increasingly different regulatory drivers. So for the EU, I think it's working really closely on international standards development and buying into international standards when they're appropriate. I think CSRD is really done that with respect to allowing greenhouse gas protocol or ISO greenhouse gas accounting standards to work in their conformity assessment. I think something similar needs to happen for CBAM, although it's, you know, that's a whole other conversation. But I think that also, just being open to benchmarking approaches, so minimum standards or minimum prices, as opposed to having to really extend the EU's model. So I think these are all examples of the types of flexibilities that will be necessary. And I guess that segues into, you know, in some sense, while I was talking, in the back of my mind, I was thinking, okay, I'm pretending right now that we're not in this like madly populist environment. I think the animal spirits are particularly animal right now. And that's true in the US, but it's also true as everyone responds to the US, and so, you know, in the EU as well, and in the UK and lots of other places, there's really serious questions about how all these, you know, net zero targets are going to perpetuate into the future, given a lot of fear of backlash. And I think there are all kinds of real practical impacts of that. We could list them for a long time. And certainly one of them is a rollback in ambition. So, you know, we see that in, you know, what's going on in Canada, for example. It's like, okay, what we need to get our own oil, you know, so it's like that's where I think the security agenda comes into the climate agenda. And I think that that's one way. And I think that the Trump administration's impetus to de-risk supply chains also fuels that, as well as increasing inflationary pressures. So it's certainly something that is, you know, I don't know what the collateral long-term outlook of it all is, but it certainly seems like a worrying moment.
Thank you very much. Let me bring on Colette. Can you hear us, Colette?
Yes, hi, thank you.
Any questions you want to respond to?
Yes, I'll try to keep it quick, but just a couple of them. I think one that hasn't been responded to yet is the question about the foreign firm in, the trading partner. I would potentially suggest the question might be not just about ownership, but rather about whether the firm operates across borders. So if you have, say, a firm that's in the EU and say in India, this could be either ArcelorMittal or Tata Steel, right? Ownership here, I think, whether it's Indian ownership or EU ownership doesn't really matter that much. If a firm operates in more than one jurisdiction and one of them is covered or is the EU and one of them is a trading partner, then that impacts the position of the firm, typically vis-a-vis some of those instruments, right? So on CBAM, and I heard this from some of the firms that I've talked to. Basically, they say, look, we've got firms in the EU, they're benefiting from CBAM. So as a firm globally, we're going to take an agnostic approach because we don't want to be sitting on both sides of this discussion, right? And there's also the ability that, and it's already happening, some of the firms are actually shipping some of their production not towards the developing country, but rather the other way around. So if you've got a plant like Tata or others, and they already have production in the EU that's compliant with all of the different bells and whistles of carbon-related regulations, then for some firms, it's actually been easier to ship some of their production into the EU market, especially the ones that need to be covered by the CBAM and things like that. So I think that's also a really interesting angle of these developments and of where supply chains are moving that we really need to take into account, because the question is that what's a change that we'll want or not, right? And it gets into the fragmentation point from Brandon, which I think is also a key question. I think ultimately that reflects the fact that we don't have global regulations, agreements, and things like that, say on forestry standards or other. So everyone is free to adapt their own levels of ambitions. I think fragmentation perhaps goes beyond fragmentation of different countries and towards fragmentation also within the country between the small businesses that by and large are not able to comply and to decarbonize or what have you, and the larger businesses that have ways to do it, in part because they have access to capital. How to fix that? I think it's a really difficult question, and also connected to how not to fix that, because overall fragmentation may not be desirable, but there might still be areas where different green and non-green markets actually do incentivize decarbonization. And you see this debate currently playing out in the discussions in the EU to adopt measures to tackle resource shuffling, right? The practice whereby a business ships its green products to, say, the EU and its non-green products elsewhere. Tackling that by, for instance, not requiring businesses to report on just one installation, but rather having to report on the whole of the firm might actually disincentivize greening, because we see a lot of new firms that are being developed predominantly to supply export markets that are actually developed in a much greener way. So that might disincentivize that investment from coming in. So I think it requires some granular analysis on what's happening on those different elements. Vis-a-vis the new integrated trade and climate forum that's been announced by Brazil, I think that it's a really interesting initiative that, because it's led by a developing country, and most of them we see being led by developed countries, it might actually create more buy-in from some players in the global south, which tend to have been less participatory in these forums. So I think that could be really interesting and a potential game changer, and also in creating a fresh way of discussing some of the very contentious issues in the climate and trade forums. I think what's also really interesting is that by not having it in the WTO, or in UNFCCC, it almost bypasses a bit the forum discussion, right, which has taken up a lot of the space, I think, on the trade and climate discussion. So I'm hopeful for this, and of course, with the caveat that yet another institution can this risk fragmentation or additional another form that's just kind of there while we already have it. So, but I think it is interesting, and we'll have to see how it plays out. And then just really quickly on the EUDR delay, I think just to note, I mean, there is a risk, of course, that that delay will further open again the discussion about the exemption or the no risk or the negligible risk exemption, which has been happening, which de facto exempts EU member states from some of the requirements of the regulation. So that's something to be watching out for, because that would not help the sustainable trade agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Trevor, any comments, questions to things that came?
Sure. Unfortunately, I have to be very quick because I have to leave a little early unexpectedly. But I guess I just wanted to first talk about the Brazil initiative. So, it is different than other initiatives in the sense that it is intended to bring climate and trade negotiators in a common space, but also unencumbered by the processes and prescribed outcomes of either the WTO or the UNFCCC. Ambassador Delago has said the effort will be measured not by any particular statement it produces, but by the quality of the ideas it generates and the level of trust it produces. I do actually think that Brazil would like to have a developed country co-lead with it. So we'll see how that goes. On the Trump point, what to even say? I do think it is chilling clean energy investment in the U.S. and third countries' strategies to export to the U.S. Because of restrictions on Chinese imports into the U.S. But also, it's worth noting that now the United States is actually acting aggressively, coercively, and threatening to impose tariffs on countries for their own climate ambition. For example, the administration has threatened tariffs on any country that participates in the IMO's net zero framework. And then finally, Dr. Lowe, I really appreciated your comment. I think that in the U.S. at least, I think that the trauma of deindustrialization, which perhaps for unfair reasons has been sort of linked to sort of market access in China. So much of the clean energy discussion has been focused on manufacturing, and I feel like we haven't made the case that it will generate good quality service jobs. I do wonder, to the extent that that is the pitch on which we sort of promote some degree of détente or integration with Chinese clean energy supply chains, that it has to be accompanied by some level of restrictions on associated services in the clean energy sector to ensure that those won't also be offshored. But that would be a nice problem to have. It's certainly not where we are now. So I'll end there, and unfortunately I have to pop. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. George, any comments, responses?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe to Patrick's question around servicification and those embedded services within products. Not necessarily on the value perspective, but the fact that you do have greater IT enablement within those products does make a difference for sustainability, in that it makes things easier to measure, and there's a whole bunch of IT enablement that you can do off the back of that. So there is a sustainability aspect, but on the flip side, if it's online, it is more vulnerable. So there's a security risk as well, and that also applies to critical national infrastructure and anything connected to the electricity grid, be it wind turbines, solar panels, whatever the case may be. If it's connected to the internet, it's potentially vulnerable, which means governments are going to place a lot more focus on it because it is internet enabled. In terms of the fragmentation piece, and maybe Brendan and sort of also the overseas firms question, I think there's two types of fragmentation. There's one at the firm level, where what's your commercial response to sort of some of these developments, whether it's CBAM or something else. You can choose to abandon the EU market. That's a valid commercial perspective, and I've certainly seen some companies do that. You just sort of grin and bear and treat it like a compliance problem and, truck along with your compliance. Or you can turn it into a competitive advantage where, because you've got a greener product, because you're better at compliance than other firms, you can actually turn that into being a preferred supplier in a bigger supply chain. And some companies are increasingly thinking in that way. In terms of sort of the more macro fragmentation, I think a lot depends on how the Commission proceeds with the equivalence adequacy aspects of both CBAM and deforestation once it eventually enters into force. How the Commission recognizes carbon price paid and says yes to some ETSs, no to others, will ultimately become quite a big trade fragmentation problem. And navigating that, I think, is going to be extremely fraught with danger, because as we've already seen with deforestation, classifying someone low, medium, or high risk comes with high risk. So I'll probably leave that there.
Thank you very much. So we've come to the end of this session really on supply chains, green goals, and also how the risk to development can be addressed. And I was struck by a couple of takeaways. One is these interesting frameworks we have, the trilemma idea, of course, and also the green squeeze idea as conceptual stories. And even in this environment where we have a lot of gloom and doom being discussed about climate, there seemed to be this great opportunity for growth through climate investment and sustainability as a new area of a supply chain. And I think that's come through. And we heard a lot about some segments of this. We heard about the production side from the Indian steel story, which I thought was very interesting, but we also heard a bit about the services side. There is then the issue of standards and regulation that's coming in, and we've heard about the EU approach and those of others. And there was thought of having some common global standard, which I think is obviously terribly important. And then there is this interesting issue of the costs that are borne, both within the developing world, but also within different sizes of firms. And there's a question mark of whether this is just purely for the large firms and the bigger countries, or can we find some way of a much more cooperative, participatory approach? And that leads me very much to this sense of aid and also trade, which may play a greater role in this, and also learning this. So this is a story that's still unfolding, and we have to think a lot more as we go down the trip. But I think green supply chains are all and well in ODI today. Thank you very much.